more of my introduction, I just wanted to give you somewhat of a history. 32 years is a long time. I don't know any organization that worked over 32 years in a communist country and survived. Okay. Actually, I was in prison twice during our time of humanitarian work in Vietnam under house arrest for violating communist protocol of they have some crazy protocols that you can't be speaking to more than 5 Vietnamese at any one time without having a government permit after you've got all the government permits to do heart surgeries and everything else. But if you got caught talking to 5 Vietnamese, you broke the major rule because they think you're going to overthrow their country. Well, as a media person, do you guys know, obviously, who Morley Safer is? He was an American correspondent during the Vietnam War. How about Tom Brokaw? Do you know who Tom Brokaw is? You're before your time, but they are still commentators on American news.
Yes,
they covered the Vietnam War, and both Morley Safer and Tom Brokaw were attached to my company during the Vietnam War. And there's a famous photo. If you're doing any history on Vietnam, it's called the Zippo photo. And that's where a young Marine has a Zippo lighter in his hand and he's torching a village roof because they were made of straw. And that photo appeared on Life magazine's cover, which was an American magazine during the Vietnam War up until probably the late 90s, when I'm not even sure if it made it that long. Well, anyway, Morley Safer, I was standing next to the guy who was on the photo torching the village that ended up on Life magazine. It was my platoon, and we were in that particular village, and Morley Safer was covering the operation that we were on. Morley Safer went back to Vietnam in the late 90s. And he met our organization. We were doing hospital work, medical work in Da Nang area. And he went back to write a book called Flashbacks. And at the time we had, one of the things that we would do, we'd bring former Vietnam veterans back to Vietnam. And then we would have meetings with our former enemy, which were called VC Viet Cong, or NVA, which is North Vietnamese Army Regulars. And we would sit across at a restaurant and we would, through interpreters, speak to each other about our wartime. And it was amazing for us that these former enemy had as many problems as we had with the Vietnam War. And we used a term called reconciliation, that we were no longer enemies, that we wanted to do something positive for their country. We were not ashamed of the war. We were not ashamed that we'd fought the war. In the Asian mindset, the warrior is a very valued and honored person. In the Western concept, your enemy is your enemy and you hate him till you die. Well, the Asians don't have that concept. They honor the warrior, and they considered us worthy opponents, and we considered them worthy opponents. And so we bridged that gap of no longer viewing each other as enemies. And that opened the door for us to begin to go deeper into our humanitarian work. And Morley Safer attended one of those meetings, and in his book that was called Flashbacks, he devoted a chapter to meeting this organization of Christian veterans that wanted to go back and help rebuild the country of Vietnam. And so those were key openings for us because we made very important connections. You know what networking and the value of networking. If you don't have it, you don't have anything. You're not going anywhere. And so all of the former North Vietnamese regular Army officer corps became the officials that ran the government once the war was over, and especially if you were the winner. They were now occupying chief government positions. And I'm saying all of this to help you understand that that little incident at that little meeting opened the door for us to have very high level government friends in this communist country, that whenever we would have a problem, we knew who to call, because there's an Asian proverb that says the king's edict stops at the village gate. So whatever happens in headquarters in Hanoi, the local village people decide whether they're going to accept it or not. And it's raw politics from a communist level. But if you knew somebody who was at headquarters that could apply a little pressure to the village gate, all of a sudden you were given the permits and you were given the certification that you needed to actually do something positive for the people. And so that's how this whole thing unfolded. And we were able to survive in this communist atmosphere of confusion and chaos for 32 years and bring back over 5,000 Vietnam veterans back to Vietnam, do over multi-million dollars worth of work, build 36 medical clinics, hold so many, I think it was, I don't even know the exact number anymore, at least 56 open heart surgeries on children. We did orphanages. It was just an amazing thing that two former enemies that at one point hated each other actually became the vehicle that was bringing and elevating healthcare of the Vietnamese to a higher level and standard. So that's kind of my introduction to why we did it, why we stayed, and we're still connected to it, but we're phasing out because we're not younger anymore. Just getting there's enough to kill you, so let alone living there. No, I enlisted. I volunteered. I was 17 years old and I was so sick of school, so sick of high school. I didn't even know that Vietnam was a country, didn't know it existed. I went and saw the movie The Longest Day, and it's an old black and white World War II movie. Walked out of the movie and walked into an Army recruiting office and asked if I could join up. And they asked me how old I was, and I said 17. And they said, when you be 18? I said, like 10 months. And they said, well, come back in 10 months. So I was walking out, and the next door was a Marine Corps recruiter. And I said, I'd like to join the Marines. And he said, how old are you? And I said, 17. And he said, outstanding, you're old enough. And he says, will your mother sign for you? And I said, I have no idea. And he said, well, that's okay, because the laundry lady down the hall, she'll sign for you. And that's how I got in the United States Marine Corps for 6 long years, and ended up almost 2 of them years in Vietnam. So no, I asked for it and got it. Temporary insanity. Well, boot camp, I think at that time was 14 weeks. And it was everything that I suspected it would be, plus 10 times worse. Marine Corps boot camp, and I'm obviously going to be biased on this because I went through it, and I know a lot of guys that went through Navy or Army boot camp, and they don't even come close. Marine Corps boot camp, you don't learn anything about war. You're not taught a whole lot about all of that. All they do is humiliate you, break you down, tear you to pieces. You learn obedience, you learn to respond, you learn to obey at whatever they tell you to do. It's all about the reforming of your thought process. Obedience, you are asked to jump, and you jump, and it was the hardest thing I ever did. And as a 17-year-old kid, it definitely had an impression upon me. People say, well, that sounds cruel, that type of environment. I never understood boot camp until I was in combat. Boot camp will never make sense to anybody until they're laying in a rice field and they're being shot at by 500 enemy. and there's guys dead and wounded laying all over the place, and you got to deal with it. That's when boot camp makes sense. It'll never make sense until then. And I am a firm believer that if you haven't been prepared for it, you will never, ever be able to survive that type and that level of combat, and shifting into survival mode, which is regulated purely by response. It is purely by obedience and purely by luck. So it made sense when I entered into that level of combat. Boot camp is not just about being physically fit. I was a cross-country runner at 17 years of age. I could run for 2 weeks and not stop. It was 120 pounds, and I was a push-up champ. You know, I had abs you wouldn't believe it. They're still in there. They're hidden somewhere, but it really it's mental. Boot camp is mental, and you're either going to pass it mentally or you're not. And that's where the culling takes place. If you know you can't obey that ugly, mean sergeant that's telling you all of these nasty things. I remember asking him one time. I kind of, you know, like the second day, I was trying to figure all this out, and I asked the drill instructor a question, and that was like the death penalty at that point, because you asked him a question. And I said, Sarge, could I ask a question? And he just took his what's called the Smokey the Bear hat. He took it off, threw it on the ground, just got in my face like you would not believe. And he says, "You blankety blank blank, do you know what Sarge is? It's a stinking dog food. Do you think I'm a dog?" And in 1964, there was a dog food called Sarge. And, you know, and I'm sure that wasn't the first time this drill instructor had ever been called Sarge, okay? And so he had pat answers for everything. And it was a total mental stress. If you couldn't handle this mental stress, you weren't going to handle combat, and you're going to do nothing but screw up my Marine Corps. And I am here to see to it that you don't screw up my Marine Corps. And 14 weeks of that, by the end of it, you know, you were, you know, ready to leap tall buildings in a single bound, freeze water with a glance. And you were ready, man. You were going to go and do whatever they wanted you to do, and do it happily. It was in boot camp that you know, if you were going to run, you ran in boot camp. And don't get me wrong, there's running is a survival mode. You know, when you got 20 people shooting at you and you're the only one standing there, you got to be an idiot or John Wayne to think that, you know, you're going to just charge forward and kill all 20 of them. That's, you know, John Wayne never left Hollywood, so, you know, block him out. He's a fantasy. So running was okay. It's just that there is an emotional response that's called fight or flight. And there's a little bit of difference because, you know, there's an old adage in the military that says, "Don't hang around brave guys, they draw fire." So, you know, there's a whole concept here of surviving in the midst of this environment where everybody's trying to kill you, and there are more of them trying to kill you than there are of you trying to kill them. Mm-hmm. So there is a place for just good common sense.
For sure.
You know, so the first official troops in Vietnam came in March of 1965, and they were the 1st Battalion, 9th Marines. And that was the company that I was assigned to when I was stateside in San Diego. And I went over on a replacement ship, a troop transport ship, because the 9th Marines landed in Da Nang, March 65. And as they were guarding the Da Nang Air Base, they were the official first American troops to be officially placed in Vietnam. There were troops from the United States government operating in Vietnam all the way back to 1961. But they were advisors, they were there unofficially, and Johnson made that commitment of the first troops into Vietnam. And so 9th Marines started to take casualties. And I was getting out of boot camp. I was trained in infantry, And so I was a prime candidate to be a replacement. So I was on a ship and I went over. It took 30 days to get there. I can't figure out why it took so long, but I'm sure it was all the politics involved and getting permission to land in the harbors, and all that was involved in that. And so I remember it was just like in the movie that made me enlist in the Marine Corps. There was a ship, there were these rope nets that you had to go down. I was an M60 machine gunner. I had an M60 machine gun over my shoulder, about 75 pounds of gear, and I had to go down this net and get what we call little Peter boats. And then we would go to shore. We weren't under fire when we landed. We landed in the Da Nang harbor, and we got off, and some little cute little girl comes up and puts a leg around your neck and welcomes you to Da Nang. But it was so hot, I couldn't breathe. When I came down that net and you're in the boat, you kind of got the moisture from the ocean. But when that, got out of the little pier boats, and we started walking up the beach with all of our gear, we're going, damn, it's hot. We can't breathe, man. And that was our first impression. Like, you were soaking wet, and just from your own sweat. And so then they brought us into a great big hangar, and they assigned us units, and basically they put me in 1st Battalion, 9th Marines. It was 3rd Marine Division, and I was assigned to Bravo Company. Unfortunately, the history of 9th Marines, and just a little trivia here, which this is something that, I'm very respectful of, and amongst Vietnam veterans, especially Marines, and you tell them that you were a 1-9er, that's 1st Battalion, 9th Marines, they go, ooh, man, how come you're still here? And had the highest casualty rate of any unit in Vietnam, and they had the longest combat history of any unit in Vietnam. We had more than a battalion of us during the complete, I think it was 7 years of while they functioned in Vietnam. The highest casualty rating, KIA or WIA, KIA for killed in action, WIA for wounded in action, of any Marine unit in Vietnam. And our moniker was called the Walking Dead. And Ho Chi Minh tagged us with that because General Gayat, who was Ho Chi Minh's commanding general, promised Ho Chi Minh in 1966 that he would eliminate the 9th Marines and to consider them as walking dead men, that we will kill every one of them. And so there's the history of the particular unit that was called the Walking Dead of the 9th Marines. And we were at the DMZ, all the way DMZ to Da Nang, where all of the North Vietnamese divisions came down. And so we were the first point of contact against all of these crack and North Vietnamese army divisions that fought the French. They were as well equipped and even better equipped with hardware than we were. And they were tenacious fighters. They knew how to fight. These weren't your little village Viet Cong who was a farmer by day and a guerrilla by night who took pot shots at you. No, these were trained infantry. And some of the fiercest fighting of the Vietnam War was done by the 9th Marines. I landed in August of 1965 as a replacement. In September of that same year, one of the helicopter bases, it was called MAG 16, which stands for Marine Air Group, was completely overrun by the R-20 Dockflap Division. And that was kind of my introduction into the fiercity of this particular police action that the newspaper said that we were involved in. It wasn't a legally declared war, it was a police action. And they overran the entire base, and they destroyed, I think, 16, 17 helicopters. I saw how serious they were. It was their home. They were defending their home, and they were tenacious with it, and they were smart. And I could tell you the little, how they did it is they snuck in through the coast in little basket boats that are very small. And you'll see these little basket boats throughout some of the photographs of Vietnam. And they had little loincloths on. They coated themselves with oil and they just rolled in the sand. And they had satchel charges and they sacrificed themselves and went through the barbed wire, went through all of our defenses and just ran through the airfield. And they would throw a satchel charge, which is a pack and it has explosives in it. And you just pull the cord, toss it into a helicopter or an airplane and it blows it up, catches the fuel on fire. And that's all they did. They weren't there to see how many of us they could kill. They were there to destroy and cripple the helicopter base. And that's where, we were resupplied by those helicopters. Our wounded were taken out by those helicopters. They were gunships that defended us. And so it was a real education that these aren't a bunch of third world dummies that we're fighting. These guys got a strategy. These guys are into this and they want to win. They really want to win. And so as a young kid, you're figuring all this out and going, damn, I thought boot camp was bad. So it was an eye opener. And I respect them to this day. I've sat and talked with a lot of them. We've shared war stories. And yeah, we have I respect for each other. And there's a lot of Vietnam vets that they can't get over. They have a hatred for the North Vietnamese or the Viet Cong and even for Vietnam. And for some reason, beyond our own selfishness, we come to understand that they were like us. They believed they were right. They were defending their country. I believed that communism was wrong. We wanted to stop its spread. And at 17, you're looking for adventure. And, you want adventure. You want to go where it is. And, it all seemed so right. But then you found out in the end, just like us, man, they believed like we did. And here we are now at that time, we're late 40s, 50s, 60s. And we're going, they're not all that bad, and again, the Asian respects the warrior. I never was ridiculed, spit upon, or anything by a former enemy. They respected us. Now, one of the village chief in one of the areas, we built a medical clinic, and one of the first medical clinics we ever built. And he was a former North Vietnamese regular, and he had his leg shot off, and it was in the Quay Son Valley, and he had a wooden leg. And we're at a meeting, and I remember asking him if he was a former NVA soldier and if he lost his leg fighting in the Quay Son Valley. And he said, yes, that he did. And I said, well, I fought in the Quay Son Valley. And I said, did you step on a mine? And he said, no, a machine gunner caught me and shot my leg off. And it was an emotional moment. It's an emotional moment to this point. And I said, well, I was a machine gunner in the Quay Son Valley. And I said, I don't know if I shot your leg off, but that's what I was there for. And we ended up, embracing each other. And there was no animosity or hatred. It was just the simple fact that we were there and this is what we did. And it's over now. And we need a health clinic in our village. And you're here to build it. And we want to work with you. And so that was the story. That was the true essence of what reconciliation was. That two former enemies are now working together. Reconciliation is a step beyond forgiveness, because forgiveness is the first step that somewhere along the line you have to bridge. But once you have forgiveness, to reconcile means you have to become partners in whatever it is you're going to do in the rest of your life. And so, if you're an old soldier and you hear all these stories and what we even did in World War II after we defeated the Germans or the Japanese, what America always did. They helped rebuild the country. And there you come back to reconciliation, that now we want to work together. And so our part as with the country of Vietnam, we didn't win. We were withdrawn. Okay. We'd always say to each other after, the war, and we were back in our regular duty stations, we'd look at each other and say, we were winning when I left. What happened? And so we went back and reconciled, and we had to work with a communist government that, if you're a former soldier, especially an American, they just think that overthrow their country. And there's so much cultural differences that we really had to humble ourselves, and we really did have to try to work with them as best we could and capitalize on the humanitarian end of it, and the fact that we're no longer just enemies, that we've got a common purpose, and let's work together as best we can. You have to go through some, my language, you have to go through some deep shit to come to that place. And most people have not. We're so enamored with false heroes and false images of war and concept and the heroism of, and don't get me wrong, there were a lot of heroes. I know real heroes, okay. But there's something always deeper. There's something always more important. And we're all human beings, and we're all cut from the same cloth. And once we realize that, and that we can work together, we can do it. So, in the midst of the horror of war, there's always, the other side, where just the comradeship and the I guess ability to be human comes into play. And there were times, well, you're so young, I'll use names that you probably never heard of, but there was, we all know that Bob Hope went to Vietnam. Well, there's another lady, there was a movie made about her. Her name was Martha Ray, and she was a singer, and she entertained the troops. And she was probably in her late 40s, 50s when Vietnam was coming on. And they were going to fly. Every hill in Vietnam on a map is designated by a number. And we were on Hill 22. And on the grid of a map is little squiggly lines, and each one of those is a certain number of feet. And at the top of that squiggly group of numbers, lines, is a number, and that means that hill is so many feet high. And so Hill 22 was 22 feet high, and it was this large sand dune, and it was probably, a block long. And it's, in the military, we call it the high ground. And so it was the highest place where you could observe enemy movement, and we had a platoon base there. And Martha Ray was in Da Nang entertaining the troops, and she wanted to go to one of the more forward bases. And in the Marine Corps, we call them hills. In the Army, they're called fire bases, because they would have, artillery and all of that. Well, the Marine Corps is the lowest budget of any military of the four branches. So we didn't have all of that. We would be very ill-equipped in relationship to how the regular Army was. And so we used that hill as a base to patrol from. And Martha Ray we were told, we got a radio message that she's coming out, and she wants to just talk to some of the forward troops. And anyway, my squad was charged with being security for when the helicopters bring her, and there's 3 helicopters. And so I'm told that, okay, when we see the choppers coming, you're to take your squad and run out, set a perimeter around the helicopters. And so helicopters, we have smoke grenades, green ones, yellow ones, red ones. And the green smoke marks where the helicopters are supposed to land. So they pop the green smoke. And or we run out, we pop the green smoke and we set a perimeter. Well, the helicopter pilots are scared to death because they got this famous celebrity, Martha Raye, in their stinking helicopter. So they see this movement on the ground and they think it's the Viet Cong, and they're here and we can't land with Martha Raye. So they peel off and they're on the radio. We could hear them on the radio and saying that, we see enemy movement, all of this sort of crap. And, and we're, no, we're the security. And so they circle around, they circle a couple of times and they come back and they actually land. And with Martha Raye were what we called donut dollies. And these are Red Cross workers who aren't nurses. They're kind of like, I guess staff that run errands and all that kind of stuff and help the troops in the hospitals and so forth, and go out and give donuts and coffee to the troops. So we've got 3 young females and Martha Raye and about 3 of her crew on this little hill called Hill 22. Well, it was a sand dune with cactus growing on it. What people don't understand is you have the South China Sea, and then for about a mile, you have the most pure white sand you could imagine with pine trees growing in it. And it's like rolling foothills. And then it drops off into rice paddies and dense jungle as you get more towards Laos. So we're overlooking the rice paddies and the jungle. We got the ocean to the one side and the mountains and jungle to the other side. Well, this sand dune, we have 2 latrines dug in this sand hill, and they're not closed, they're boxes, and we call it a 4-holer. So here's about 75 guys. We've been eating sea rations for probably 3 months straight. We don't eat hot chow. We're eating out of those little green cans that were left over from World War II. And Martha Raye brings us hot chow that was spaghetti. And, just try to imagine that, these girls are giving us donuts and these people are serving us spaghetti. And all of a sudden you've got the quickest case of diarrhea that you've ever had in your life. And there's nowhere to go. There's only the 4-holers and there's nowhere to hide it. And then all of a sudden, all of our officer crew figures out we got a major problem here and we got to get these people out of here. And so the wonderful connection was broken up real fast when all of a sudden it just went through us like water through a hose, because we were just not adapted to that, So that ended our Martha Raye experience, okay? A very severe case of diarrhea, and we never wanted to see hot food again, It just didn't work. And somehow, somewhere along the line, they just hadn't figured this stuff out yet, So that was funny. I don't care how you sliced it, that was pretty funny. And I've got a picture of that 4-holer to this day. And 2 of my be sitting on it. So remember when I told you that General Giap, who was the commanding general that defeated the French at Dien Bien Phu, he promised Ho Chi Minh that he would wipe out 9th Marine. And in May, it actually was May 12th, we have what's called a ZOA in the military, and it's our zone of action. And our zone of action was expanding. We were in central Vietnam. Da Nang is central Vietnam, and we were moving south. And there was a key river that was called the Tu Bong River. And General Giap told Ho Chi Minh that he would wipe out the 9th Marines when they crossed the Tu Bong River. And it was in, I think, somewhere in around November of '65 that statement was given. And there's conflicting stories about when that actually happened and how the 9th Marines got the moniker of the Walking Dead. And They're different views, and I'm sticking to mine because I was there. Okay. Um, we were the first unit to cross the Tubong River, and we went through a village. We had to fight our way into the village, and it was a total Viet Cong controlled area with an R-20, what was called a Doc Lap battalion, of a mixture of reinforced Viet Cong and North Vietnamese soldiers, highly trained, wanting to engage the Marines. And we crossed the True Bong River, and we were on an operation that was called County Fair, and we were looking for the R-20 Doc Lap VC battalion, and we found them. And actually, my platoon was the point platoon leading into this particular area. And we knew it was highly full of Viet Cong. We had chased some that day. We had engaged them that day. And then we were to set up for the night. And there was a lot of confusion because there's three companies, Alpha, Bravo, and Charlie, and Delta Company, actually four, in a battalion. And we were trying to coordinate how we were going to engage and really find out if they were here, what their strength was, and what was going on. And so that next morning, we sent out what was called a security patrol. And we always did that to make sure that large masses of troops couldn't sneak into our perimeters, our zone of action, and engage us. So we always had somebody that was circling around our particular area, and they sprung the ambush that was set for the entire company, of what was called Bravo Company. And we lost contact with them. And so we went to find them, and that engaged the entire company. And that entire company was the point element of that was first platoon. And first platoon took the brunt of that. The 14 men in the initial ambush were killed instantly. It turned into a 3-day battle. We engaged, we were fighting 750 Viet Cong is what the estimated battalion strength was. And there were about 150 of us. And they were highly trained, highly developed. There were helicopters shot down. I was in one that was shot and grounded and was able to get out, but was, able to survive. And it was just an intense 3 days of battle. It was one of the first major engagements where they decided to stay and fight and not run. And it cost them dearly. I mean, we have artillery, we have air power, we have naval gunfire. Every mortar round that the North Vietnamese fire, some little man carried it in a backpack from North Vietnam down the Ho Chi Minh Trail and supplied it. And they were well supplied, don't get me wrong, but we spared no expense. I mean, when it came to fire superiority, we always ruled. And they didn't have planes. They didn't have, thank God they didn't have. They had artillery, mortars. I mean, they could do damage, don't get me wrong. But they had the element of surprise, and they knew the area where they were. And we later found out that it was their boot camp that we had walked into. It was where they were training the village people to be the local police force, the local Viet Cong. So it was something they did not want us to find. And it's why they sprung that ambush they didn't want anybody crossing that True Bong River. And so we were the element that did it. And it was just so intense. There was one of my buddies was right next to me in the rice field, and they were plowed rice fields, and his name was Dirk, Lance Corporal Dirk. and he had been shot in the leg, right through the leg, and he was just flopping around. I mean, and the fire was so intense that if you just looked up and tried to see who was shooting at, you'd be dead. You just could not imagine the intensity of the fire. And so I see this guy flopping around, and we later at a reunion and so forth, we discussed this, that I crawled over to him and I literally laid on top of him and said, "You can't. I don't care if you bleed to death, but you're not going to get shot again, so just chill. And don't try to get up. Don't try to roll over." And I don't know how long that. It's a horrific story. There's many, many parts to it. And that's about as deep as I want to get into it. But it was, we lost that one. We lost so many Marines that day. It was they were just dead and wounded Marines laying everywhere. And 750. I got the article from the Stars and Stripes magazine. I'll send you that, of that day's battle. And with it, it's well documented. And I think there were, at the end of the battle, there were, I think, 3 Silver Stars awarded. I'm not sure if anybody got a Navy Cross, but Bronze Stars. I don't know how many Purple Hearts. It was one of those things that movies are made about. And then when it's over, just get up and do it all over again. That's the amazing part. And I remember one time in my own PTSD counseling, which I went through years later. You don't realize that this affects you so much. And even with all of our humanitarian work and everything we did in Vietnam, I was still suffering from my own survivor's guilt and PTSD. You just don't realize how deep the emotional wounds go. They go pretty darn deep. And it's hard to, come to some sort of rationale about it. You're always pushing it down. You're not going to let that emotion find a place to register inside of you. And I use a term, it becomes like good wine. The longer it stays in the bottle, the better it gets. And PTSD never gets better, it gets worse. But that's what we did. Somebody's got to uncork the bottle and get all that crap out that you stuffed down in there and held down in for so long. And so me and Dale, we became pretty good friends. After that one, we ended up on the hospital ship repost together, and then we're sent back to our unit. And we had a good joke over it. He was a deputy sheriff of some county on the east coast of the state somewhere, and I'm Canadian. And I've been in Canada 32, 33 years now. And I tell everybody I was a slow bloomer. I moved to Canada after the war, not before. So they're still trying to figure me out. So it was lost. It's one of those things. You don't win them all. You survive them all, but you don't win them all. Mm-hmm. You realize that there's certain things, there's certain keys, there's certain. I couldn't, if I was to watch a movie and it was Bambi or some stupid little puppy movie, I'd have an emotional breakdown. And my kids and my wife, they just couldn't figure out what's going on with Bob, what's going on with Dad. And it just all came to a conclusion, and I didn't know what it was. And then as I got more involved and began to educate myself about PTSD, and I finally went to the VA. And then when I went to the VA, they look up your records and they go, "You were in the 9th Marines?" And I said, "Yeah." And they said, "We got a special place for you. There's mattresses on all the walls. It's nice and padded. Come with us. We'll take care of you." And so I did the VA was very good to me. And, I have no complaints. They really helped me. So in the long-term perspective, um, you don't understand the depth of how your character, your worldview, your sense of belonging are all affected by those young years. To be 17, 18, 19 years old is when character is formed. And so here it is in the midst of all of this trauma and all of this tragedy. There's good that's taking place. There's a loyalty, there's a commitment. I had one of my PTSD counselors one time ask me, he said, Bob, why didn't you just stand up, throw your rifle down and say, hey, I'm out of here? And I looked at him and I said, you're kidding me. Was that an option? And so we go back again to that training, that, the reforming of the mind and your will and character and commitment that takes place in boot camp. It's a form of brainwashing, and maybe at the time my mind needed a good washing, I'm not sure, but it was all connected, and the rational person doesn't endure that. And a rational person would ask me that question, and I got no answer for it because I never even knew that question existed. Why didn't I? And it wasn't an option. So it was an option for other people, but it wasn't an option for me. And though I respect those that took the option, it wasn't for me. So, and it was an option to go back. You think about going back, what it took to go back and to face that and to go back to that country. And it's a little story. In 1989, the only airline that flew into Vietnam was Air France. And the Tan Son Nhut Airport was completely undeveloped. Communist is a great system for fighting a war, but it's a crappy system for running a country. Okay, they are totally undeveloped. There's no health care, there's no nothing. People starving. It's all about, it doesn't work well. Okay. So there were, I don't know how many of us there were, and this is where 2020 did that interview. And well, just to give you an example of what type of an Tan Son Nhut Airport was. Baggage claim was a dump truck that drove an old deuce and a half Army dump truck that drove up to the baggage door on the Air France line, and they threw all of the baggage into the back of the dump truck. It drove towards what was a shanty building that was called the terminal and dumped all the luggage in a pile, and we picked ours out from the pile. So that was Tan Son Nhut Airport. It's one of the classiest airports in all of Asia right now, 30 some years later. But way back then, that's what it was. And customs was an NVA soldier with his AK-47 next to him, and he's sitting at a desk and he's got a hat on with a star on it, and he's smoking a cigarette, and he's looking at you like, who the blank are you, and what are you doing in my country? And he wants my passport. And he's holding it for about the first 2 minutes upside down before he realizes that his buddy shows him that it's upside down. And so then he turns it right to show me that he can really read it and knows what's going on, and stamps it and hands it back to me. I mean, it was cold sweats. It was out of this world. And yeah, that was 1989. We made it. I think that statement, it has a lot of room in certain areas, because when you say it don't mean nothing, nothing meant anything. If the guy next to you, there's a strange thing that happens when you live in an environment of death. That it becomes so normal and casual. Like the guy to the left of you is dead. He gets shot through the head and he's 6 feet away from you, and you just can't figure out why him and not me. And then the guy over here, gets shot in the shoulder or whatever. And the only way you can survive and begin to process that is that you can't let it get to you. So, from the perspective of a guy that steps on a mine that was meant for a tank, that it blows him apart, what are you going to do? What are you going to do? You can't allow it to mean something, because if you do, you're totally inadequate. You're worthless. Don't show up for work. And there was one incident early on. It was what I call it's the death of Dutchnowski. And we were sent out, 14 of us, because that's an average reinforced squad, and it has 2 machine gun teams. And I was a machine gun team most of the time. Sometimes I was just a rifleman because we needed them. But anyway, there was this battalion that we were chasing of North Vietnamese and in BC, the R-20 Doc Lap. And they said, we believe they're operating in this area, and we want you guys to go out, and we want you to see if you can find them and let us know if they're there. And so we basically ran and humped all night long to get to this road junction and to set up at this road junction and observe movement. And so we get there at about 4:30 in the morning at this particular road junction. And we set up, and we're on one of those sand dunes. This one might have been Hill 50, who knows? It wasn't that high off of the ground. And we dig in and we're observing. And all of a sudden we start getting sniped at. And when a sniper and being sniped at are not the same thing. Being sniped at means that the local VC, who's a farmer by day and a Viet Cong by night, has went to his barn, oiled up his rifle, and it's maybe World War I vintage, and he's brought it out and he's leaning it up against the fence, and he's going to take a pot shot at you. And the pot shot, they couldn't shoot worth a darn. Most of them, I was trained with a rifle at 500 yards to hit the center. 500 yards, that's 5 football fields. I can't see 100 yards now, okay? So I can't imagine how I ever did it. My eyes allowed me, but they don't anymore. Well, this old farmer guy, when they start shooting at you, you didn't really worry because they were usually 20 feet over your head, or they were so scattered you didn't take them. That's the local VC. Well, it begins to increase, and all of a sudden there's a little bit more trained fire coming. All of a sudden it's kicking up. Hey, these guys are getting serious here. We're giving them too much time. And all of a sudden we're fully engaged. I mean, we are fully engaged. And all of a sudden, 14 guys can only carry so much ammo. And I've got to conserve ammo as a machine gunner and the squad leader. And then we had a second lieutenant that was with us. They said, Bob, we want you to take your machine gun and we want you to cover this road from the rear so they don't come in at us from the rear. And so I pull up my gun and I start moving that position, and you hear a distinct high-powered rifle has a crack to it. And when you've been in combat in any World War II soldier will tell you, they know the name of every weapon, every bullet that they hear. They know exactly what weapon fired it. Every mortar round, every rocket round, they can tell you exactly what it is because they all make a distinct sound. And so this was a high-powered rifle, probably a 308 or something like that, very high-powered. And I hear it. And all of a sudden I hear our platoon sergeant holler, Dutchnowski, Dutchnowski. And so he runs over and he drags Dutchnowski out of the hole that I was in. And Dutchnowski had a round entered right above his right ear and went right through his brain and out the other side. And what am I going to do now? And so, it's training again. So I set up where I'm supposed to be and cover the road. And then it lulls down. All of a sudden, it's not as intense as it was. And they're trying to call a medevac. And Datsyanovsky's already dead. I mean, there's no way you survive that. And all of a sudden, I start to think that was not being sniped at. That was a sniper. And he had me in his sights because I was an automatic weapon. A machine gun fires over 1,000 rounds a minute. And their purpose, once you get the right guys that you're fighting that know what they're doing, and they got the right guys, they were where they were supposed to be, want to take out your automatic weapons. And so I moved, Datsyanovsky jumped in, and he just took the shot, even though it wasn't the automatic weapon. And so we endure all of that. I think we have 3 WIA, 3 guys wounded. I think 1 guy died in the hospital after Datsyanovsky was killed. And they had to come and rescue us. They sent 3 tanks out. And obviously, when it was all said and done, the battalion was right where they suspected it to be. And that evening, when they finally got us out of there, when the tanks came, they blew up part of a village, and it was a big mess. We make a big show, and then we leave. And that ended it. There was nothing. So the whole point of the exercise was that if you find them where they're supposed to be, blow the bugle, and we'll send reinforcements. And as the old cavalry, if you ever heard of Rin Tin Tin, we'll send them to the rescue, and we'll just engage these guys, and we'll have a major battle, and this is how you win the freaking war. But they didn't do anything. So we did that whole exercise. Those guys were killed, sacrificed themselves, and nothing. They didn't bomb it. They didn't call B-52s. Didn't do anything. And, that's November. And then in May, we're back here again where they're killing us, slaughtering us, because we didn't deal with them in November. And that was the craziness of the Vietnam War. And that statement has all sorts of, don't mean nothing. There was lack of purpose. There wasn't a clear vision. The organization that I helped found, it was me and 1 other man, and we were both Vietnam veterans. When we named it Vets with a Mission, because when we were veterans during the war, we did not have a mission. Our mission was not clear. And so if we were going back to Vietnam, we had to know what our mission was. And so we were veterans with a mission, not veterans with no mission. We're here for some God knows unknown reason to be here. And I think the best definition of what the maybe true mission was of those first years in Vietnam was to see how many of them we could kill. And if we can kill enough of them, maybe they'll get discouraged. And they knew nothing of the Asian mindset. They knew nothing of the Vietnamese culture. They knew nothing of its war history. Those people have been fighting wars for 100 years and longer. And they were seasoned, determined people. And they, if you don't know your enemy, you're going to pay the price for what you don't know. And there was no strategy. No, the only strategy, when you go into a village and was search and destroy. That really wins the villagers over to your side when you burn their houses down. That's a real neat strategy. Hey, we're from America and we're from the government and we're here to help. So we're going to burn your house down and all your food supplies. Yeah, and try not to, really a good way to win their hearts and minds. So we had a mission when we went back, and we were going to win the people and show them that we want here. We're not coming back to destroy your country. We're coming back to help build it. And that became the mission. And I'll say this, every Vietnam veteran has a different story. Mm-hmm. And our war was so different. You have heard the term the tip of the spear in our modern war jargon on news, especially from the American perspective, which is obsessed with going to war. War on drugs, war on crime, whatever, the solution to solve any social problem is to go to war with it, and it's really proven how successful it really is, Well, anyway, the tip of the spear. You don't get any farther out on the tip of the spear than being a Marine grunt up in the DMZ all the way down to Da Nang, Chu Lai, Hoi An. That's where the rubber met the road. I remember meeting a guy that I went to boot camp with, and we were on the Da Nang tarmac. That's the air base, the landing zone, waiting for helicopters to be moved up to an operation called Operation Hastings. And he heard that I was in 9th Marines, and he came out to look me up. And I'm sitting there with all my gear. I've got clothes that I haven't changed, and they're ragged. I got no t-shirt. I've got a flak jacket, a helmet, 250 rounds around me, and sitting there eating as a sea ration, waiting for the helicopter to pick us up and probably drop us right into some hot LZ somewhere. And he comes up to me and he says, Bob, good to see you. And he goes, have you seen any combat? And I just looked at him, and really, look at me. And he was an MP at the Da Nang Air Base. Never had a live round in his pistol. He had it in a magazine. He never had a live round in his pistol. Never been shot at. Never shot at it. Had no idea. No idea. And the two guys that were with me, the three guys to a gun team, and they said, yeah, well, let's bring him on the helicopter with us. Yeah, have a good time. You'll see some combat. And so everybody's war was different. There were people in rear areas that, maybe they'd get mortared every once in a while, but this was the daily routine for a guy like me. Every evening at 6 o'clock, 3 squads to one squad went out on an ambush at sunset, and you stayed in that ambush hidden, trying to ambush enemy movement at night till 12 o'clock. At 12 o'clock, you came back to your patrol base and you sat in a hole until sun came up. 2 men in a hole. One guy slept for an hour. The other guy watched for an hour. From 12 o'clock to 6 o'clock, a second squad went out, and it rotated around your perimeter looking for any troop movement or anybody that was out past, I think it was 9 o'clock, whatever the curfew was in that particular village area. And it was called an open field of fire because the enemy would move at night. They owned the night. And then one of the other squads would go out all night long in an ambush and sleep for 1 hour while one guy was awake for an hour, and then came back in the morning. And then you got up and you put your 60 to 75 pounds of gear on, and you search and destroyed, went through rice paddies, climbed the mountains, did everything, sometimes engaged the enemy, sometimes not engage the enemy. Sometimes you were in a firefight that would last 2 days. Sometimes it would be a small skirmish and somebody would get shot in the leg and you'd have to call a medevac. This was daily routine for 13 months. This is what you did every freaking day. You didn't go back to a what we called a hardback tent, which was a canvas tent with a wood floor. You didn't go back to a barracks. You didn't go back and get a hamburger at the PX. They'd fly sea rations out to you. You had a can opener called Peak 38, and you ate out of that can. You had a black sock that you put 4 cans of sea rations in, and you tied it to your cartridge belt. And that cartridge belt was what you ate out of for the next 2-3 days. And then they'd resupply you with ammunition. They'd kick out a bunch of sea rations that were left over from World War II. And you ate them. And I mean, we were fit. I mean, we were hardcore. I don't know how to say it any other way. You endured all of that sleep deprivation. I got a picture of a guy walking. He's carrying his M14. He's walking. He's got has no shirt on other than his flak jacket. It's 105 degrees, and he's literally sleeping as he's walking. His eyes are shut, and he's sleeping as he's walking, carrying his rifle. Well, yeah, that's what it was. So that's the tip of the spear. And you didn't want to be at the tip of the spear. That's when they said, "You're going to 9th Marines," and everybody just rolled their eyes and went, "Yeah, okay. So good luck." So tip of the spear. Yeah, I think that the Western world does not do suffering well. I think that COVID is teaching us that we don't do suffering well. Suffering is probably one of the greatest personality formers and molders in existence. And our culture, especially now, thrives on success, thrives on higher standard of living versus lowering their standard of life. That, failure is never accepted. Failure is failure. You don't learn anything from it except I don't ever want to fail again. So we live in a culture that has a very small worldview. It's a cruise ship worldview. It's a holiday worldview. It's a vacation worldview. You stay in the luxury hotel and the begging kid is across the street with his 2 brothers and sisters with a tin can trying to sell you bubble gum and cigarettes, so you don't really experience that. And I think as a young man and experiencing what I experienced and then coming home and trying to fit back into normal society, I didn't know how to do it. I was ill-equipped. I was not trained to come back and fit into society. I went to a church, and some of my friends had been attending that church. And so I went to the church, and I was born and raised a Catholic, was an altar boy. And, I was a prime candidate for, my whole Vietnam experience of the American, mentality of anti-communism and all of that. I was fruit ready to be picked by whatever recruiter was going to pick me. Okay. But when I heard about forgiveness, I never heard it that way before. When I say that, I'm sure as a Catholic growing up, I heard all about forgiveness, but it didn't mean anything to me. There was no can that it could be deposited in. And so when I heard this man talk about that's all I heard, that I could be forgiven. And, there are some things I did in Vietnam that I wasn't proud of. Our humanness, at a certain point, you just become really angry. This guy Dudznowski, the first guy I actually saw, die right in front of me and be shot. There was, you want some sort of revenge, and to not be able to get it kind of just burns that hatred deeper into you, okay, if you allow it to. And somewhere in the mix of that, um, when I heard forgiveness, I knew that I understood that there was forgiveness and I had to have forgiveness. And I accepted it. I went back to the God that I always believed in as a young Catholic Italian boy in my neighborhood at St. Rose's Parish. And I never doubted my faith in Jesus Christ. And even during the whole war experience, I never did. I was, believed. It formed something in me that began the process of me changing. And that's where you make the difference. I didn't want to just sit in a church and, this is my faith. I go to church every Sunday, even though I did. There had to be more to it than that. And that's why I define what reconciliation is reconciliation is this next step beyond forgiveness. That, okay, I number one, I want to forgive myself. I want to know that I want to come clean and with God. And war is dirty business, and it's not a clean thing. And so there's a cleansing that has to happen. And then once that happens, then you can begin to try to make something positive out of it. You can begin to build a better boat than the one you were in that's going to carry you through life. So I think that compassion and understanding. I saw poverty that I'd never seen in my life before. I saw starvation. I saw people so humbled and the tragedy of war. And I also saw how serious they were defending their country, their right to be who they were. And somehow in this immature, uneducated mind of mine, by the grace of God, I was able to process all of that and come out the other end a better person. And most Vietnam veterans only have memories of the war. And why we wanted to bring Vietnam veterans back to Vietnam. Vietnam is one of the most beautiful countries in the world, the kindest people, beautiful people. They needed new memories, and we would bring them to get new memories. And I became a pastor of a church. And my church was highly involved in Vietnam, small little street church, no big deal. But the veterans would finally get memories that were worth having. They were bigger than the war memories. And they were part of doing something that was reconstructive to the opposing destruction that they were involved in that didn't have any mission, didn't make any sense, wasn't connected to anything. And so now it could finally be connected. And let me tell you, it was life-changing to them. I mean, life-changing to them. There was one guy, he was a former Marine, and it's kind of a sad story, but it's an important story because even in the midst of humanitarian work, sometimes it just becomes a business and you could never allow it to do that. But we were driving a place called Mito, and this guy had stepped on a mine and blew both his legs off. He didn't have any legs below the waist. And he's on this trip with us with 2 prostheses and hand crutches. And we're in the bus, and there's probably 30 of us on this medical team. And probably half of them were Vietnam veterans. And it's hot. There's no air conditioning in the bus. It's an old Russian bus left over from when the Cubans occupied Vietnam, or the Russians were there. And we're going to find where he actually stepped on this mine. It was a road junction, and he knew where it was. So we're out there looking for it, and it's an emotional, just imagine both your legs, and this is the place that it happened, and the bus is parked. And so, we're bringing this guy through this emotional, just agonizing thing, and he's just crying and carrying on, and And all of a sudden I hear the horn on the bus honking. And the horn is honking, and there's this guy, come on, come on, come on. But it was just a lucky thing I wasn't armed that day. Okay. I lost it and basically, told him where to do and where to go. And if he didn't like it, that he could get out and walk back to the hotel. But even in the midst of every story that I'm telling you, there's a part of humanity that doesn't get it. Okay, it doesn't get it. Somewhere along the line, we control our response to things. Nobody else does. And our human defects, our human imperfections are going to come out. And how are we going to handle them? And, is somebody going to be gracious with us, or somebody going to be condemning to us, or whatever? It's just the law of human nature and human kindness. So in the midst of all of that, here we have, even in this humanitarian group, people that are pissed off because it's hot and they're sweaty, and this poor guy doesn't need another 5 minutes, wallowing in a place where both of his legs were blown off and his life was changed forever. So you got to deal with the crap that's out there, even in the midst of the beautiful, wonderful humanitarian mission you got. Yeah, you got to deal with it all. Yeah, about 40% of Ninth Marines have died from cancer. Okay, I was diagnosed at the age of 57 with what's called seminoma cancer. Seminoma cancer is it's testicle cancer, but it's not testicle cancer. On the male, the testes drop down the side when the baby is born. And if those testes don't drop, you have a 20% chance of getting what is called seminoma cancer. It's a seed germ cancer. And I was diagnosed with cancer, and they didn't know. It's another level of what Lance Armstrong had as cancer. And my oncologist definitely connected it to exposure to Agent Orange. When I told you that every hill had a number value to it, one of our company and battalion patrol bases was called Hill 55 in Vietnam. And over 300,000 gallons of Agent Orange were poured on that hill to clear the brush and jungle that was around it, so that when you're on top, you have 500 yards of clear sight. You're not looking at trees or bushes. People can't sneak up on you, and then you string all your barbed wire out there. So it basically is a safety zone. So it was over 300,000 gallons of Agent Orange was poured on that entire village area and village complex. So you're now digging holes in it. You're cooking your sea ration can with your, eggs and ham. We call them ham and mothers. And you would, cook it, and you ate in it, you slept in it. If you got shot, you bled in it. And so we were definitely exposed to Agent Orange, and Vietnam vets have a very high percentage of diabetes and cancer. And one particular incident, we were on another little hill, a company hill. It was a small one. I think it was Hill 22, because there were these gnomes everywhere until you got into the jungle. And that night we heard planes fly overhead, and we know the enemy doesn't have planes. And it was like a fog came down on us, and it was a mist. And what had happened, we didn't know it at the time, but that next morning they told us that we were going to be issued all new gear. And Marine Corps has a term called 782 gear. And 782 gear is your web belt, your helmet, your flak jacket, your canteen, your first aid pack, everything. They said that they're going to be reissued all new 782 gear. And so they brought a great big net, helicopter. They spread it out and they said, strip down, put everything in this net. And so we did, and they sent out all new utilities for us, jungle fatigues, cartridge belts, everything. And they took the old stuff and they flew away. Later on, we found out that they had sprayed us with Agent Orange, that the planes were off target, and they sprayed our hill with Agent Orange. I made a French documentary years ago. The French company did it. I think I'm the only one with a copy of it because I'm the only one speaking English. And it was a Vietnamese man who immigrated to France, and he was really in the Agent Orange movement. And they flew all the way to Vancouver to interview me for me to tell them that story about Agent Orange. And it was, he understood because he was Vietnamese what it did to their farmland. Obviously, working in the medical profession, we saw lots of deformities. I can send you some pictures of deformed legs and arms and so forth, because we saw the fruit of it all. But there is one positive part of Agent Orange, and that some of the richest farmland in Vietnam today was where they sprayed Agent Orange 50 some years ago, because the Agent Orange eventually dissipates and all of that vegetation that went back into the ground produced some pretty rich soil. Not many people are ever going to let that cat out of the bag, but Vietnam is farmers, and not just rice, but they're farmers, and some of the richest farmlands were a product of that horror of that particular war. And one of our first projects was polio orphanage number 5. And polio in 1989 was a #1 disease of death and crippling of children in Vietnam because the communists were afraid of the vaccine. And so we worked with a Catholic nun, Sister Jean Marie, who ran polio orphanage number 5. And we rebuilt their therapeutic pool, all of their dormitories. We basically rebuilt their kitchen, all the supplied new beds for the kids. And we basically fed them for almost 7 years. And then the government called it the best orphanage in all of Vietnam and took it away from Sister Jean Marie and claimed it as their own because she wouldn't give them kickbacks from the money that we were giving her. So she went out and started another one. But disease, healthcare in Vietnam in the early stages, you would walk into a local hospital and there'd be somebody with a brain hemorrhage. And all they did was drill a hole in his head, put a plastic tube in it, and run it down the side of the bed. And I saw grown doctors walk in and see things like that, nurses, and just walk out crying. They said they couldn't even go, they couldn't stand the smell. Vietnam right now has one of the best healthcare systems in Asia. Their healthcare has come so fast. We had one of our veterans, I think it was 3 or 4 years ago, had a heart attack in Vietnam. And he had a 3-way bypass, and while he was in Vietnam, and it was one of, as we've always got at least, half a dozen doctors with us, and they were amazed at how well it was. In fact, we've had doctors that have trained their doctors at the Hue Medical School, the Da Nang Medical School. We now sponsor students to the 2 medical colleges in Vietnam are sponsored by us. They're ethnic minorities. That means the extreme poorest of the poor can become a doctor in Vietnam. So Agent Orange listed a certain few cancers, and seminoma wasn't one of them. But so, yeah, it was a real tragedy. I was on a medevac flight back to the States. I was spent quite a bit of time in the hospital recuperating, and then came back to the States on what was called a medevac flight, and I was walking wounded. So I was in LAX, and when I got off of the plane, I did not recognize. I left in 1965, came back in early 67, and the whole world had changed. All of a sudden, there's protesters, there's whatever. And I remember encountering protesters and calling baby killers. And it was horrible. It was just, you think that there were no cheering crowds, there were no, veterans group welcoming us back. It's an amazing thing about the Vietnam War. The World War II veterans dishonored us. They didn't welcome us back. It wasn't a real war. And you guys, you weren't really fit to be in the same league as us. And Vietnam veterans never joined all of the foreign war organizations, the VFW and so forth, after World War II were established, because they were never welcomed in. And you talk to a World War II veteran, and they, you just weren't in their league. So there was no support. The VA was in shambles. The military was in shambles. I was sent to Port Chicago, which is the West Coast ammunition depot for the Vietnam War. It's out of Concord, California. It's a port city. I was sent as one of the first returnees. They didn't know what to do with the first returnees. I was stationed in Port Chicago because it was close to the Presidio in San Francisco, which was a hospital, and I was an outpatient receiving treatment. And so I had a duty station, and then I would be able to keep my appointments at the, I'm not sure it was a VA hospital, but just a military hospital at the time. And what my role was, I was a Sergeant E5, and I was a combat veteran. Went over as a what's called a Lance Corporal in E3, and came home in E5, a sergeant. I'd actually, had been in combat and earned my rank because I knew what to do in combat, but I didn't know how to be a garrison Marine. And so all of the senior Marines that were there were all World War II veterans, and they hadn't been to Vietnam yet. And so they expected me to be a garrison Marine. I remember this gunnery sergeant says, "I want to take the tune and march it to the parade field." And I said, "March to the parade field?" So I don't know how to do that. I have no idea. He said, "Well, you're a sergeant. Haven't you been to sergeant school?" I said, "No." "You haven't been to NCO school?" "What's NCO school?" And they said, "Well, how in the hell did you become a sergeant?" And, the answer was, one that lived. I lived long enough to be one. And they didn't really have a concept. They were still set in World War II. And so, even in my own branch of the military, it was not done. But I knew how to lead men, and I was very capable of leading men. And I had the respect of the men that were there and the respect of the Vietnam veterans that were coming back and were being stationed. So you know what they put me in charge of? The formal burial detail of all the KIAs coming back from Vietnam on the West Coast. So you've seen the formal military funeral where they fold the flag, they fire the 21 gun salute. I was the NCO, non-commissioned officer in charge of funerals in the Bay Area and surrounding areas I was doing 6 and 7 funerals for dead Marines a day. We had a double bugler that would play taps. I trained, we made this whole thing. We wanted to honor them as best we could. You do that for 6 months and you're a freaking basket case because you don't want to hand one more mother that flag. You don't want to walk up and say, we're a grateful nation, and give that lady her flag when she wants her son. And so I just couldn't do it anymore. I think I lasted 9 months. I still had 2 some years to do of my enlistment. It was a 6-year enlistment. And so that was a horrible experience. So I started self-medicating. I got to hide the pain. And the Vietnam experience was raw. So I finally went to my senior lieutenant and I said, I just can't do this any longer. And he was a Vietnam vet and he understood. And so he said, okay, I'm going to put you in another unit and you're going to become what was called a brig chaser. And so I traveled across the United States with a team of 5 other Marines, and I was in charge of the team. And we picked up military deserters and prisoners and criminals. And we flew all over the United States. And we'd pick them up at jails and we'd fly them back to San Francisco, which I'm sure you know of. There's under the Golden Gate, not Golden Gate, but the Bay Bridge, is a military Navy base called Treasure Island. And it was a Navy brig, our jail, and we would turn these prisoners into there. So I went from doing the funerals to now having to deal with all of the deserters. And being a draft dodger is not a deserter. Okay, there's a distinction. A deserter is somebody who was in the military, committed a crime, did something that was wrong, and ran away. So it's a whole different ballgame. It wasn't some poor draft dodger that we were bringing through the airport. It was a deserter. And so again, I can't write this stuff. You talk about a dirty job, and it was pretty dirty. And I'm in airports, and I've got all these. We'd pick up 9, 10 at a time. And, back then it was not military transport, it was commercial transport. We had to fly in and out of commercial LAX or Houston, Texas, or Florida, or wherever it was. And so everybody thinks you've got this group of poor little draft dodgers. And it wasn't. These were hardened criminals. They were bank robbers, rapists. They were just, military's full of bad people, and just like any other culture. And so that was my job. And finally, finished it up and got out and came home and tried to live a normal life. And God was gracious. I made it into that church. I understood what was happening. And I began to put all the pieces together and made good choices and found a real sweet lady that accepted me and actually said yes when I asked her to marry me. That was 50 years ago. And she went back to Vietnam with me almost 7 times. I think it was 7 times she went back with me. She worked in our pharmacy, distributed medications, and fell in love with the kids. Got one of her good doctor friends to go back with us. It was just a sweet, sweet experience. I had nothing negative to say. A lot of the stuff seems so negative, but in reality, it was the foundation of what positive, good things were built upon. And what can I say? Oh, most definitely. Like I said before, I think out of the hard times of life is where we established our true identity and who we are. If you're familiar with the movie Saving Private Ryan, the first time I saw it, I just couldn't. The opening of that movie was so dramatic. He's there and wherever it is at that graveyard site, in probably Normandy. And you see him walking, and he's a shaken man. And this is Private Ryan. And you see his wife and his daughter and son and whatever. And they're going through all of the graves. And then he finds Tom Hanks, who the character that, the individual that he played, Tom Hanks played's gravesite. And you just see him in front of this gravestone, and he's just crying, and he looks up at his wife, and he says, "Tell me my life meant something." And that was the key word that defined that movie, because he was the one that all those soldiers died to allow him to live. And to me, when I saw that movie, wow, I said, man, Tom Hanks directed it. And I thought, he understands. There's something, your normal person would never catch that. It wouldn't have been something that would have stood out to them. They would have saw the movie, loved everything blowing up, would have loved all the action, would have loved all of that, but it didn't have any meaning other than entertainment. But that statement at that grave defined what survivor's guilt is, what it costs to be a survivor. And I suffered with survivor's guilt a good majority of my years. But I turned it into something that was positive, not something that was negative. And that's a choice that we all make with the situations and crisis that we go through in our life. We're going to make a choice that we're going to allow it to be a positive influence within our life, to humble us, to tenderize ourselves, give us more compassion, give us more desire to make something better than what it was. It's our choice. Or we can just become a bitter old guy. And I know a lot of bitter old veterans. The VA's full of them. And there's one thing about Vietnam veterans that I learned, and why so many of them are the way that they are. And I never want to discredit any veteran in any way, shape, or form. Vietnam was the most important thing they ever did in their life. And they were 18, 19 years old, and they've never done anything important since then. And they'll go back to their Vietnam. They'll wear their camo. They'll have all the buttons and dingbats on their hat and everything, and tell their story about Vietnam. But the 65 years since then, not a whole lot going on, because they never got past their problems in Vietnam. And that's a true tragedy. And that movie, Saving Private Ryan, he looked up, "Tell me my life meant something." He wasn't sure. He wasn't sure it was worth it. I believe it was worth it for me. It made me what I am today. So we all going to make that choice.